Hi, my name is Martin Moore, Assistant Chief Fire Officer with Tipperary Fire and Rescue Service, and this presentation is based on the fire safety certificate process, more specifically, more the assessment side of the house with regards to what the Building Control Authority will be doing as part of the process. So it's a cut down version of my presentation I would have given last year that's available on the NBCO's YouTube channel. So I'd recommend anyone to go and check that out. So what we'll be looking at is the requirement to obtain a fire safety certificate, a revised fire cert, or a regularization certificate, the information that should accompany any of those applications, assessment and granting, conditions, refusals and appeals, offences and penalties, and we'll very briefly look at then the differences between the Building Control Act and the Fire Services Acts. So in regards to the fire safety certificate, Article 11 of the Building Control Regulations obviously outlines when one is required. So refer back to that for a more detailed explanation, but just very briefly, I suppose it's the construction of a new building, material alterations, material change of use, or an extension that's greater than 25 square meters. Works obviously cannot commence without a granted fire safety certificate unless a 7-day notice has been submitted. With regards to exemptions, you have single-story agricultural buildings, dwellings other than a flat, single-story domestic garage, single-story building ancillary to a dwelling, works in connection with complying with a fire safety notice, and we'll talk about that at the end of the process, and works to a guard station, courthouse, barracks, and certain government buildings. And just for that one there, that's actually not mentioned in Article 11. You have to refer to Article 6 there, the Building Control Regulations for that exemption. So a revised fire cert or a regularization certificate. So under the revised fire certs, it's Article 20B of the Building Control Regs. So it's very much determined by the Building Control Authority what they will consider a significant revision to the design. So I'd always recommend that they are contacted. Not every kind of insignificant revision is going to require a revised fire safety certificate, and there are times that the existing cert may still cover any changes that might have carried out. So always worth talking to the Building Control Authority on that. Now, it is probably worth noting that I suppose there's no real definition of what is a significant revision, so it's important that the building control officer or the fire officer's opinion is sought on that. With regards to reg certs, so obviously the works were commenced or were completed without a fire safety certificate or a 7-day notice. Again, I would talk to the Building Control Authority there. There are some certain times that a reg cert is submitted and one might not have been required, or a different avenue might have been taken. So always talk to the Building Control Officer on that, or the fire officer. And also with the reg cert, there's an inspection required as well. So information required with regards to certificates, completed application form, ensuring all sections are completed, particularly for building control or the assessing officer. Very, very important to kind of check that application form is fully filled out and correctly done. So oftentimes there's anomalies either with regards to maybe signatures, or there might be issues with regards to the type of use that's been specified in the application form. It might actually contradict what's actually down on the compliance report. So it's very important to check that. Plan sections and elevations. So important to have a site location plan, a dimension site plan. Obviously, you need to have your dimensions for boundary separation and things like that, and roadways, stuff like that. So detailed floor plans then with travel distances on it, with fire resistant lines shown, things like that, all very important. The elevation should show how boundary separation is being dealt with. So it should be a case of, we should see the enclosing rectangle and what areas are unprotected. It should be very clearly highlighted, along with having levels on it and things like that. Sections, again, very important to have to be fully dimensioned. Grid lines, if they're there for reference, are very, very handy. Fire resistant lines and compartment lines should also be shown, along with maybe any kind of cavity barrier lines. And it's very important to show adequate details to certain junctions as well. So with regards to maybe extensions or material alterations, or a building that might only be going to part material change of use, it's important to kind of differentiate and to see what very clearly on the drawing what exactly is being applied for here. So that the extension should be highlighted, or the material alteration area should be highlighted. There shouldn't be any ambiguity, and if the assessing officer isn't sure, that they should go back and look for further information on that. Also very important for the assessing officer that they have unique referencing numbers and current revisions on all drawings. And I would just kind of maybe maybe just talk about a word of caution with regards to legends and keys that are on drawings. So it's very, very important that the assessing officer reviews these. Any notes or any legends or keys that are on the drawings, oftentimes there could be old references or misreferences or things that could contradict the compliance report and other items overall. So it's very important that every aspect of the drawing is looked at, not just the actual layout itself. Finally, then obviously we'll have the compliance report, which should address regulation B1 to B5 of the second schedule to the building regulations. With regards to the compliance report and even the drawings themselves, there is an argument out there with regards to performance specification versus the actual materials of construction. So obviously there on the left-hand side, I have a blockwork wall. That's an actual material of construction. So you can tell me, look, it's a blockwork wall, it'll achieve 4 hours fire resistance or whichever. Or if it's a performance specification, it leaves it kind of a bit more open-ended with regard to what the final articles of construction would be. So if there's any kind of doubt at the fire safety certificate process or stage that there's doubt as to what the final material will be that the building will be constructed of, it's always best to default to performance spec and even possibly use performance spec in general, because it just makes life a bit easier down the line. Like to give you an example, so like the protected corridor will be enclosed in construction achieving 30 minutes fire resistance. So that's the performance spec versus the protected corridor will be enclosed with concrete block walls achieving 30 minutes fire resistance. Now the problem there is if that's specified in the fire safety certificate compliance report, that's what has to be used on the ground. Otherwise, your fire safety certificate may actually be invalid and may not, when it's granted, it won't be valid for that building effectively, because if it's changed to a timber stud wall, then you've effectively changed what the building control authority have signed off on. So possibly performance spec is worth looking at in that regard. When it comes to other information that could be requested by the fire officer or the assessing officer, Argomont certificates and test certificates are often requested, particularly with modern methods of construction. Anything kind of offsite prefabricated that's heavily relying on a test certificate, we will often look for further information on that as to how it's going to comply with Part B of the building regulations. So it's very, very important that all that is available and that there is test certification or some sort of certification with the product or the system. So moving on to assessment, the Building Control Authority will obviously firstly assess the validity of the application. So determining that the compliance or the application form has been filled out correctly, the drawings are all correct, that we have all the documents we require in order to validate, so compliance report and as such. It's very important to note that the Building Control Authority and the assessing officer is restricted to assessing Part B of the second schedule to the building regulations only. Okay, this can throw up issues where the DAC may not have been applied for yet, and I would kind of I would advise any assessing officer, particularly with 7-day notices where the DAC has been applied for, to maybe run it by the assessing officer who typically looks after DACs if it's not going to be yourself, just to flag certain areas. Like for example, if there's an upper floor area that's over 200 square meters, that's going to trigger the requirement for a lift, and that's obviously going to have a significant impact on Part B then as well as Part M. So it's very, very important to possibly get a second opinion sometimes on that, or second look in. So from submission, the Building Control Authority will have 2 months to assess the application and make a decision. Look, time extensions may be requested if further information is requested as well, or if extra time is required. So during the assessment process, the Building Control Authority will assess the application against regulations B1 to B5. So it's very, very important to note that these regulations are performance based; they're not prescriptive. So it's up to the Building Control Authority to determine what's compliant with the regulation. Okay, obviously Part B, Technical Guidance Document B, if you comply with that fully, you can be deemed prima facie compliant with regulation B1 to B5. If other guidance is used, it's down to the determination of the Building Control Authority as to whether the works will comply with regulation B1 to B5. So as I said previously, with regards to the assessment of a regularization certificate, an inspection has to be carried out by the Building Control Authority. There's always a kind of a question there because it's not very clear in the regulations as to, you know, what should be checked on a regularization certificate inspection, and like how invasive should the inspection be. You know, typically in Tipperary, I can talk about, we typically take kind of a sampling approach to our inspection process. So we're not going to be shoving our head above ceiling tiles and things like that. We look at it as we see it, I suppose, and that's very, very clearly outlined by us. And just to refer you back to your rights as an authorized person, you know, you're entitled to enter any land and inspect any building relating to the application. So there, obviously the regulations there, B1 to B5, as I said already, they're performance based, they're non-prescriptive. So as I said, it will be up to the Building Control Authority to determine whether the submitted application complies with these regulations. It should be noted, I suppose, look, Technical Guidance Document B, it provides guidance to meet the regulation, but it's minimum guidance, okay? So there's often a question asked, you know, should we be aiming a bit higher maybe, you know, why are we always aiming for the minimum, you know, is it down to costs or whatever? So it's just food for thought. Moving on then to granting. So the Building Control Authority may grant a certificate with or without conditions. And I highlighted this in my previous presentation. It's very important as well for any assessing officer to realize, you know, what we're certifying, I suppose, and how it's worded. So the fire safety certificate itself is worded that if constructed in accordance with the plans, calculations, and specifications and particulars submitted, the building will comply with, or the design will comply with the requirements of Part B of the second schedule to the building regulations, okay? That's not to say that the Building Control Authority are saying that once the building is finished and fully built that it's going to comply. We are simply just certifying the design. That's it. With regards to conditions then, so for fire safety certificate and a revised fire safety certificate, normally you can get confirmation of compliance with conditions on these at the compliance on completion stage. With regards to a regularization certificate, the compliance with conditions has to be achieved within 4 months of the grant of the certificate. And then there's just some standard conditions there that you might see on certificates. With regards to refusals and appeals, like the Building Control Authority may refuse an application, so the applicant is notified. If it's a Reg Cert, chances are that a refusal may result in enforcement being taken by that Building Control Authority, whether it be under the Building Control Act or under the Fire Services Act. We'll talk about that a little later on. Any refusals and conditions that are applied to a granted fire safety certificate or revised cert or Reg Cert can be appealed to On Board Pleanála. Very important that the Building Control Authority and the assessing officer have their ducks in a row for this, because a report or an opinion from the Building Control Authority will be requested by On Board Pleanála. So have your ducks in a row and have good grounding as to why it was refused or why this particular condition was put on it. Under offences and penalties, so if a fire safety certificate or a revised fire safety certificate is required in respect to works or a building, a person shall not carry out these works or make a material change of use as regards such a building in the absence of those certificates or in contravention of any conditions to which those certificates were granted. And if a person does that and a person is found guilty of an offence under the Act, then they could be liable on summary conviction to a fine not exceeding €5,000, to imprisonment not exceeding 6 months, or to both. And if the offence continues after the conviction, guilty of further offences, and then they're liable on summary conviction to a fine not exceeding €500 for each day after the offence is committed. So just to wrap up, I just want to run through a very significant difference between the Building Control Act 1990 to 2014 versus the Fire Services Acts 1981 and 2003. And that is with regards to the limitation on enforcement. So under the Building Control Act, it has a limit on enforcement of 5 years. So an enforcement notice cannot be served after the expiration of 5 years from the completion of works or the material change of use. Now, it can be very difficult to try and actually establish this timeline, particularly if a commencement notice and a compliance on completion certificate were never submitted for the works in the first place. As such, when do we actually know if the 5 years has elapsed? Sometimes we could be taking a shot in the dark. This is in significant contrast with the Fire Services Act that has no limitation on enforcement. Okay, so under the Fire Services Act in section 19 of the Acts, it defines what a potentially dangerous building is. And that can be anything from no fire detection alarm system or emergency lighting, all the way down to that a fire could spread rapidly throughout the building. Okay, so the more items that are going to be ticked off on that list, the more likely a fire officer or an authorized officer is going to take either a Section 20 fire safety notice or go down the route of a Section 28 closure notice. So, if there's non-compliances with fire safety that might be covered under Part B, they can obviously be addressed under the Fire Services Act if the Building Control Act is gone beyond its enforcement limitation. This is particularly a significant issue if the building is actually occupied. Definitely then the Fire Services Act is probably going to be used more often than not. So with regards to a fire safety notice, it can be served upon the owner or operator of the building, and it will take effect after 14 days. The idea behind that is within those 14 days, it can be appealed. And if it is appealed, then it can't be, it doesn't take effect effectively until a judge makes a decision on the situation. By contrast, then a Section 20A closure notice can be served if the inspecting officer, an authorized officer, notes an immediate risk to life. So if it's served, it applies immediately. Even if it's appealed, it will not be lifted until such time as either a judge makes a decision on it, or if the works are carried out to the satisfaction of the fire authority. So it's a very significant kind of tool in the arsenal of the fire authority versus the limitation with regards to the Building Control Act. So just to summarize, we've talked about the requirement to obtain a fire cert and a revised fire cert or a regularization certificate. We talked about the information that should accompany such an application, such as the application forms, drawings, documents, things like that. We've talked about assessment and granting, our conditions, our refusals and appeals, and any if offences have been carried out and what penalties follow those offences. And then finally, we looked at the contrast between the Building Control Act versus the Fire Services Acts.